each generation has been less Christian than the one before. And so even if Gen Z ticks up a bit, the reality is Christianity is going to experience a significant loss of adherence in the United States.
The headlines, even from just this last week, show what happens when a culture no longer views Christianity with curiosity or even neutrality, but with open suspicion and hostility. We're going to dig deep into this today. We're not going to be talking about the headlines particularly, but we want to talk about how churches, families, and individuals should respond when the cost of faithfulness is high. So, in a world where Christian conviction now may lead to cultural exclusion, silence, pressure to conform, even death, how can we stay resilient? How do we speak the truth? How do we love our neighbors? This is a conversation that's going to explore how evangelicals can live boldly and wisely in what has been called the negative world. My guest today is Renn. Aaron's a writer, cultural analyst based in Indianapolis. He offers incisive, practical insights on Christianity, men's issues, and the social and economic forces that are shaping today's world. And he's the author of a book called Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. He's a senior fellow at American Reformer. He's widely recognized for his analysis of evangelicalism's cultural shifts, for helping Christian men navigate modern society with clarity and with conviction. And his work has been published in some of the most respected publications in this nation. I cannot think of a more timely conversation. Let's welcome Renn to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Renn, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I can't think of a more timely conversation right now, given the attacks on people of faith that we have experienced even in the last few weeks in the United States of America, the outpouring of grief around the killing of our friend Charlie Kirk. Just yesterday, I heard the news that a church in Michigan, an LDS church, Latter-day Saints, had been attacked and burned, and people were horrifically murdered. It does seem, and you've also mentioned attacks on churches in Canada. It does seem that the attacks on Christians are accelerating, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about as we talk about your a book about negative world. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Aaron, you introduced this concept, the negative world, and you cast this as a significant cultural shift. But could you explain what you mean by positive world, neutral world, negative world? Because we need to orient ourselves to maybe thinking about our culture in a new way.
Right. So unlike Europe, America never had a state church, but for most of our history, we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism, which after World War II morphed into a sort of generic Judeo-Christianity as our default national religion. So in the 1950s, half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money. That's the era that it was. This system began to become unraveled in the 1960s, and the status of Christianity began to go into decline in America. Church attendance down, personal adherence down, and Christianity's moral system increasingly called into question. And I divide this period of decline from 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. I don't want to be clear. All is not positive for Christianity. It's a period of decline with church attendance being down. And yet society still basically views Christianity positively. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society, makes people want to vote for you, hire you, loan you money. And the Christian moral system is the basic moral system of society. And if you violate it, you get into trouble. In 1994, we hit a tipping point and entered the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014. In the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. Maybe that's a better way to put it. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society, and parts of traditional Christian morality are expressly repudiated and in some ways seen as a threat to the new public moral order. And this shift into a negative world has been very dislocating for American Christians who've been used to thinking of themselves as a moral majority in the name of that old organization, which I think speaks to a positive world that no longer exists. Nobody would have created an organization called that today. So that's really where we find ourselves in this moment.
Well, I can't help but notice that the positive period that you mentioned, 64 to 94, is 30 years. And then the neutral period, 94 to 2014, is 20 year. And now in negative world, we've only been in this for 10 years. It does seem like this is accelerating somehow.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to say. I think it goes in ebbs and flows. I think there are different eruptions of cultural change, cultural shifts. So it's not it's not like just a straight line down, or sure. I'm not sure if it's even similar, but it's sort of like the stock market. Things kind of go up and down, but there's a trend. And I think the general trend has been downward for Christianity in America, to say the least.
Help us understand those tipping points in 1994 and 2014 that you discuss, because I was alive during both of those, and I'm wondering if there was something that I might have missed that was kind of a signifier.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think there was any particular event that caused a shift. I think when you're in a downtrend, you eventually go from, positive to zero, and then you just move into negative. So in a sense, these worlds were sort of baked into the model of Christian decline at some point. What I would say is a couple things, regarding the 1994 date. I do think that the collapse of the Soviet Union played a critical role in changing the role of Christianity in America, because the Soviet Union was an avowedly atheist, materialist system, and Christianity and religion were very integral to the West's moral war against global communism. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a sense, that freed people up to unbundle Christianity and religion from what it means to be a Western liberal democratic society. There's actually a new book out, very good, called Why Religion Went Obsolete by Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith. And he looks at a bunch of social science research, and he actually sees that you start to see changes in attitude starting in 1991. And he lists, 41 different factors that kind of go into it. I list 5 or 6 in my book: the decline of communism, the fall of the WASP establishment from the old 50s era, digital technology, corporate consolidation. There are a lot of things that go into the kind of cultural background there. But that's what's happening, I think, with that. I do think the fall of the Soviet Union was really a big initiator of a cultural change in America. And then I think there was another big break in the culture sometime during Obama's second term, with the Obergefell decision in 2015, legalizing gay marriage. The so-called Great Awakening on race has been pegged as starting around 2014. And that's according to, left-wing secular pundits like Matthew Iglesias. NYU professor Jonathan Haidt said 2013 is when he saw things getting a little crazy on campus. We could even say Donald Trump coming down the escalator in 2015 signaled that something had changed quite a bit there. And so something really happened there. There was a sort of big cultural eruption of sorts during Obama's second term. And then out of that, we've seen acceleration in cultural change around things like gambling, drug legalization, et cetera.
Aaron, as a guy who runs a Christian nonprofit ministry, I have to say one of the things I'm always a little bit of maybe afraid of, I don't know if this is a real fear. I just sense that something will happen in the culture and I'll miss it. Like there'll be a significant battle and I won't have shown up because I won't have known that it's being fought. I don't want to miss what is really important. But one thing that you're mentioning in the book is that when it comes to pressure on pastors, that nearly 40% of them are considering leaving the ministry. Institutional trust is at all-time lows. It seems like the very people who should be stepping up and moving onto the front lines in something like this are caving. I don't understand that.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. And I do think a lot of times we don't recognize the significance of certain events until retrospect. However, It's also the case that a lot of things have cultural roots deep in the past. So you can look at something like, say, the Obergefell decision, and you could look back at Wilhelm Reich's book, The Sexual Revolution, which was from the 1930s. I like to tell people, say, look, the Summer of Love, I'm 55 years old. The Summer of Love was 2 years before I was born. Okay, so, changes in the sexual norms in America happened over decades. And so a lot of these changes are sort of tectonic in a sense. And sometimes there's an earthquake and we see it, but a lot of times the forces may have even been building since before we've been alive in some respects. I do think being a pastor is hard. It's harder than ever that it's been. There's going to be a lot of stress on them. I think the era of sort of, you go to church on Sunday and it's kind of a refuge from the outside world a little bit. Now It's sort of like the battles of the world are going on in the church. So just one thing that really, I think I use this example in the book, COVID policy. So whatever your church's policy on COVID shutdowns, meeting, going virtual, whatever you decide, masks, vaccinations, you're going to make some faction mad. Mm-hmm. There's no way out, right, of that. And we've also seen, these things that have happened in the culture. We saw, George Floyd and BLM, or Donald Trump, or even like what the churches say or do about Charlie Kirk's assassination. There are tremendous pressures being brought to bear on these pastors because no matter what you decide to do, in most churches, there are going to be people who don't like it. And so there's maybe eventually we'll all sort into churches that believe exactly what we want and do exactly what we want. But it really puts a lot of pressure on them. And of course, the decline of Christianity, lots of smaller churches have been going out of business, that sort of thing. So, I think you look at it and it not only is it that people have been thinking about leaving the ministry, but there aren't as many people going into it. I hear a lot about the pipeline of seminary candidates drying up. I think it was Gordon Conwell's seminary had 50% declines in enrollment in their MDiv programs, over the last decade. I constantly hear that it's harder to find good candidates to pastor churches. And young Gen Z people are changing some of what they do in response to it. I was John Tyson, who runs Church of the City in New York, pastor there. He's sort of a pastor's pastor, really, really sharp diagnostician. Mentioned that, for millennials, church planting was the hot thing to do, but Gen Z people don't want to plant churches. And so I start paying attention to that. And I listen, and, one pastor heard a great, I think it may have been Josh Howerton's podcast. He had a guest on there talking about, today the heroes of young people are all social media influencers. So a lot of young people aspire to be an influencer, a Christian influencer, not a pastor. And And for those who are going into churches, now that the boomers are finally retiring or passing away, there are actually pastor slots opening up. Like it used to be, if you wanted to be a pastor in some of these conservative denominations, it's like, okay, you have to go do a stint in youth ministry or campus ministry. Then maybe you can get an assistant job. Then maybe you'll church. Now a 20-something-year-old guy coming out of seminary, in many cases, can go straight into a lead pastor position. They don't have, in a sense, church planning was an outlet for a lot of people who wanted to be pastors but weren't going to get that opportunity. Now they have the opportunity. And so, and I was just, I've been paying a lot of attention to this young influencer. He goes by the name Redeemed Zoomer. He's got 600,000 followers on his YouTube channel. Okay, so he's got a big audience. And he's a very theologically conservative guy who basically argues, go into mainline denominations, and if you just show up there, we'll inherit the denomination because all the old liberals are dying off. That's an oversimplification. Yeah. But I do see, like I just saw young guys like, hey, I was very intrigued by what he said. And I saw that, if I wanted to go into a more evangelical Presbyterian denomination, I'm going to have to go into debt for seminary. I'm going to have to spend all this time, in apprenticeships. In the PCUSA, mainline Presbyterianism, they're willing to not only pay for the rest of my seminary, they paid off the debts I already racked up, and I'm essentially a lead pastor of a small church as a ministry intern. So the opportunity space is shifting a lot, and so there's a lot of dynamics there, but I think Gen Z is smaller, boomers are going away, the pressure is intense, people are worried about racking up a lot of seminary debt. So I think all these, this very dynamic environment is different. People want to be influencers today, not pastors. I think there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, well, that we could probably spend a whole other show just talking about that one issue. I wonder if for the pastors who are teaching in, say, non-denominational churches or more conservative denominations, my sense was all of those grew because folks who had biblically orthodox beliefs got kicked out of a lot of the mainstream churches. So they went and started their own. And it turns out more people want to go to those churches than go to the previous churches. That seemed to me to explain church growth more than, new people coming to Christ.
Yeah. There's some of that. I think there is a lot of recirculation through churches to even people moving from kind of one more conservative non-denom to another one. As models change, what you've now seen is I see some mega churches now that have what I call mainline disease. That is to say, they're getting older. They're not attracting as many new people. There are fewer kids. They may be shrinking. They probably have a facility that was built 25 years ago where church was done in a very different model. Maybe they were optimized for one single large destination campus versus the multi-campus model, maybe that people like today. And maybe their music is not exactly what it all is. And you start seeing these things and, there's like 15 new churches that have all been planted and they're drawing people. And, by the way, the suburb you planted in is now a suburb where all the kids have grown. It's an older population there. It's not as dynamic itself. And so you see these dynamics start affecting even some of the older, the older, more evangelical churches.
Man, this is really interesting. One of the things that Justin, who helps prepare for the show, one thing he's really curious about that I'm very curious about is what are the ideological forces that are behind this? Because you mentioned demographical changes, but there's more to it. That people are the way they think about and process the world, as you mentioned earlier, is not happening through a Christian framework. Now, I think a lot of people would argue that it never really was. It was always just more of like a civic religion kind of mindset that people had. But what's the new ideology? When you're looking at someone, they look the same, but they think totally different. What is the new thinking?
Yeah, well, again, I would sort of commend Christian Smith's book on why religion went obsolete, because he really goes into that, talking about the belief systems of younger generations and how they differ. And really, I don't want to try to give a précis of his book, but one thing I do want to hit, and Rod Dreher is another writer who just has a knack for putting his finger on what people are going to be talking about next. His book, The Benedict Option, came out in 2017, was probably a little too early to market. Pope Francis didn't like it. The evangelicals didn't like it. Now, apparently, people are like, oh, this book was ahead of its time. His latest book was about the re-enchantment of the world. I think it's called something like Living in Wonder. And I think re-enchantment is a big theme. We went through a period of like hyper-rationalism. Think of it as modernism. It's rationalistic, it's materialistic, it's scientific. Then we went through the postmodern moment, where everything was relative there. And I think what we realize is that these modes of thinking about the world don't really address, the felt spiritual needs or whatever. Quite apart from your objective spiritual needs as taught by Christianity, it's like it's not helping me psychologically cope with life. It's not giving me a sense of meaning and purpose, that sort of thing. And what we've seen is the rise of what you might call a re-enchanted spirituality. And one of the things that you see around in this is, number of people who are taking psychedelics. One of the changes in the culture that comes from a negative world, everybody likes to dial in on sexuality, and of course that's a big one. But the negative world is it affects everything pervasively. And so, now it's, I think, pretty popular, I would say, probably a majoritarian position to legalize pot. Mm-hmm. Now, I think we're starting to see that, there's a lot of problems with legalizing pot. And we'll see if that keeps up. Even the New York Times is kind of like putting up some warning flags. But it's not so much that it's legal. It's that it's accepted. Mm-hmm. And, I live in an upscale suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana, in one of the less upscale parts of it. And these people all work for corporate America up here. And, they'll openly talk about consuming edibles or whatever. So sort of middle class, upper middle class professionals, there's no shame in taking drugs. And so it goes beyond pot. It goes towards the psychedelics, the magic mushrooms and ayahuasca. You ever hear about people going on these ayahuasca trips in South America? So I think there's an interest in things like psychedelic experiences, being able to connect you with the spiritual realm. I think that there's a lot of interest in the occult and things of that nature. And so I think that there is a sense, the spiritual, even of course the basic spiritual but not religious movement. It's very, a lot of this is Eastern influenced. There's a lot of pantheism, that sort of thing, sort of, de facto pantheism. So I think people are seeking meaning today through these sorts of spiritual practices that they see as connecting them with their authentic self. And so kind of in our world, the idea is you want to be your authentic self. You want to find a way to express that. And rather than looking to the Bible to tell you who you are, it's like I will go through this process of self-discovery, maybe involving drugs. So that's one aspect, I think, of how, how to live your life. It's vaguely spiritual. Spirituality is good. Enchantment is good. Religion, bad. I think is how a lot of people would see it there.
Everybody's talking about Gen Z and what's going to happen with Gen Z. Wouldn't it be interesting if Gen Z researchers actually put together a report about their own generation, what they are thinking, how they think, how social media affects them, and how to reach them with the truth? Well, that's what we did this summer. Along with two Gen Z researchers, we put together the State of the Rising Generation. Now, I put mine in a little binder. I'm going to tell you in a second how to download your copy for free. But in the State of the Rising Generation report, you're going to learn what is happening with Gen Z, the influence of even things like AI. You have no idea how AI is changing the way those in the rising generation think, and then what it will take to reach them with the truth. All you have to do to get a copy of this for free is go to summit.org/risinggenreport. Summit.org/risinggenreport. Download it. Share it with your friends, share it with all the teachers you know, the pastors you know, and the parents you know, because it's critical that we make these connections with the rising generation to reach them with biblical truth. At one point, when I was doing research for a book, I went to a New Age festival, and it was interesting talking to people. Like, I talked to one guy who was a spirit channeler, and so his job, what he gets paid for, $20 for 15 minutes or whatever, and he goes into a trance and words start coming out of his mouth that he says are from a disembodied spirit. And I asked him how he knew that what he was saying was true, and his answer was, well, I know that it's true because in a previous life I was an Egyptian elephant princess. You know, and I looked at him and I thought, he's completely serious. He's not messing around with me. He's completely serious. That is his evidence.
Yeah.
And I wonder, you know, when you say, hey, would you like to come to church? And they're like, and somebody says, hey, I had a psychedelic trip. I know more than you.
Right. Yeah, it's weird. You know, I even think this re-enchantment helps explain certain phenomenon, like Jordan Peterson getting so big. You know, because Jordan Peterson's Jungian view of the world, seeing the world through these sort of symbolic archetypes and sort of metaphysical truth, I think is very, very resonant with this idea. It's kind of New Agey. I mean, if you look at the definition of what New Age is, it's not, but I would categorize Jordan Peterson as fairly New Age. He would say Christianity is true. He would say that, but he doesn't mean it's true in the way that you and I would mean that it's true. And so he's even like recapitulating scripture through this sort of Jungian lens, where scripture is sort of a distilled essence of, you know, these archetypes and truth, primal truths about, you know, humanity and the nature of ourselves and the nature of reality, but it doesn't speak to, you know, stuff like whether Jesus was actually resurrected from the dead or something like. He's like, you're missing the point if you talk about that stuff, you know, creation. And I think he has some insights on the text, the way he talks about, you know, seeing creation as a drama of chaos and order, I think is an interesting way to look at it. It sort of is, in a sense, God brings order out of the void, but it's a lot more than that. You know, it's not just that. And so I think, you know, what the product he was selling, his interpretation of the Bible is very resonant with the way people like to think about the world today. It's like a resource for getting at deeper meaning and deeper layers of reality, but it doesn't necessarily make many claims on you. Wow.
Yeah. That would also explain a lot of how Joe Rogan approaches spirituality and some of the other podcasters who are huge. So on the surface, it may look like a kind of a cultural Christianity, which when I was growing up, if somebody said you're a cultural Christian, that was a slam against your spirituality. But now it's as if you can have the conversation, but is the conversation really about the one true faith that was given once and for all, or is it about me having the opportunity to experience the thrill of seeking deeper mysteries?
Yeah. Yeah. Now I look at some of these podcasters who get big, and you don't get to be big, you know, by not being attuned to the cultural trends. And so, you know, they're often glomming on. They see what's hot and will glom onto it. And so that's where you mentioned Joe Rogan. That's where I think there actually is a little good news here in a sense, you know, in that Rogan would have been a guy who you would say was very hostile to Christianity for a long time. Somebody who at the Gospel Coalition's Canadian site did an inventory of every guest he had on his show, and like couldn't think of any that were like openly Christian. And to the extent that he made comments about it, it was disparaging. Well, now he's hosting Christian apologists. He's making these statements. We're also seeing various, celebrity conversions. So I do think people talk about the so-called vibe shift in the culture. And I do think there's a little bit something to it in the sense that some of the overt hostility of the woke era is now past. I mean, it's very clear that the woke moment in culture is in retreat, hasn't completely gone away, but corporations are getting rid of their DEI programs and things like that. And obviously Trump being in the White House has a lot to do with that. I think that lessens some of the overt hostility to things on a number of fronts there. But I also think, again, this search for meaning, people I do think are open to Christianity as a form of spirituality. And again, I don't know that, treating it as just another trip is really the right answer. But I think there actually has been some people who are, becoming Christian. You hear about young men going to church, et cetera. And I think, I follow Ryan Burge's, this academic who does a lot of quantitative study of religion. And he wrote the book on the nuns, the NONES. He does say that kind of the increase of the nuns has sort of plateaued in the last 2-3 years. So he's like, there's some nascent signs, not really statistically significant, but I do think there's some of the negativity is diminished a bit in some respects, and I think the podcasters a little bit see it. But again, I still say we're still in the negative world. Again, some of the violence you just alluded to, I think, attest to that. Although I would say, I do think it's important to say, and I make this point in my book explicitly, I don't like to say Americans are being persecuted for their faith. I think that does happen in individual, very rare cases, but we are not in China. We're not in North Korea. We're not in some of these countries in Africa where you could get in trouble. We're not in India. We could be a victim of sectarian violence. Most of the pressure that's being put on Christians is sort of social pressure. It's more subtle. It's more indirect. It lowers your social status to believe certain things. And so it creates sort of the background conditions. It's like more pressure on your container, and you got to be able to resist the pressure. And that's why I do think, for example, you can't understand the deconstruction phenomenon apart from the negative world. It's no accident that deconstruction and the ex-evangelical memoir became big in the negative world, because as the status of Christianity changes, there's a lot of incentives to deconstruct from it or to change the contents of your Christianity to align with certain things. So I'm not saying the negative world's gone away by any means, but I also don't want to be relentlessly negative or overly bought into my own model that I miss some of the cultural trends that are out there. I do think there's a little bit of openness to Christianity. I mean, maybe is there going to be a mass revival? I'm not predicting that or anything, but I do think it's kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, this is really, I think it's very interesting. We did a report called The State of the Rising Generation that's just coming out this summer, and we interviewed Ryan Burge for that. We also interviewed Steve Garber, which was an interesting conversation because we asked him, what trends do you see? And he said, you usually can't see God's providential moves in history at the moment. You can only see them by looking back in time. But we can see statistical things happening. So, I see a lot of evidence with the young men that we're working with here at Summit Ministries, as well as what we see in polls, that young men are returning to church in numbers that I haven't seen for a long time. I'm not sure that Ryan puts a lot of stock in those in those polls, but I'm just saying, as a guy who works with these young men, I'm seeing a level of seriousness among young men. And I think the ones we work with are representative of of the culture that I haven't seen for a long time. I think that's a great sign for hope. And then you've got a guy like Charlie Kirk, who's, every time I was with him, this conversation came up. These are the lost boys of America. Our job is to, sort of buck them up, give them courage, give them, the sense of responsibility to do the right thing. And I wonder, with his assassination, if a lot of young men will kind of wake up now and say, you know what, that's true. I need to step up and take responsibility. I can't just sit around and smoke weed and play video games. I have to actually make a difference.
Yeah, we will see. I have a lot of optimism about Gen Z that other people don't have. I think, every generation gets kind of blasted suffering from moral decline. Gen Z gets a lot of bad press. They're supposedly all mentally ill from their smartphones and things like that. And there's some of that. There are some of the lost boys, but some of the Gen Z people are just so impressive, when I meet them. And I feel like Gen Z has a completely different psychology around Christianity than older generations. So, again, if you're a boomer or you're Generation X, you remember the Ronald Reagan era. You remember sort of what a sort of Christian America looked like in a sense. And, you think about that decline since the 60s, though. You've also lived through all this decline. And so you went from a positive to a neutral to a negative world. Or if you're a millennial, maybe you went from a neutral world to a negative world. So your experience is of Christian decline in America. And there's this sense of loss over what we had and what we no longer have. Whereas Generation Z never knew a Christian America. Like the negative world is basically all they've known. In a sense, they don't expect to live in a Christian society. They didn't grow up with the expectation that America was a Christian country and, everything needed to do it. So that produces a completely different psychology around religion that I think is more optimistic in a sense than people who are dealing with this sort of narrative of loss, which the previous generations are. But what I would say that's baked into the cake, if you look at the numbers, each generation has been less Christian than the one before. And so even if Gen Z ticks up a bit, the reality is Christianity is going to experience a significant loss of adherents in the United States as the baby boomers and Generation X essentially die. They're the ones who are very heavily religious. And so we're going to lose older, more religious generations, and younger generations are significantly less religious, even if, we see this sort of revival, if you will. So barring some sort of mass revival that dramatically changes the trend lines in terms of people who are really active, engaged Christians, it's going to be, there's going to be decline. That's just the reality of it. And that's going to have a lot of implications for churches. In a lot of ways, right? And boomers have a lot of the wealth. They funded a lot of the ministries. They funded a lot of things. And what's going to happen when that money's not there anymore? It's going to be interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, to say the least. I think probably a lot of the people who are watching or listening to this show right now are boomers and Gen Xers. I'm a Gen X guy. You're a Gen X guy. What do we? But we still have a responsibility to do what Jesus told us to do, to teach people to obey God in every area in which Jesus Christ has authority. What do we need to be thinking about in doing that for the rising generation?
I think in our society, basically America has revolved around the boomers since they were teenagers, in a sense. And if you think back, I'm not sure exactly how old you are. I kept thinking if I go back to when I was in high school, growing up in the 1980s, and all of my favorite songs, how many of those songs were literally by baby boomers and literally about the baby boomer generation? I think about Bryan Adams' Summer of '69 or Bruce Springsteen's Glory Days.
Yeah.
Or when Phil Collins sang "My Generation Will Put It Right," things like that in TV shows like 30 Something, for example, the boomers were 30 something, of course, then. And so we've all been living in a culture that has been dominated and shaped by the baby boomers. And then the baby boomers were able to achieve very significant positions of leadership and authority at a fairly early age. And they've been holding on to those positions of authority ever since. So, I think was it Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump were all born the same year. I mean, If you think about it, we elected our first baby boomer president in 1992, and it's still, we've had nothing but baby boomers, basically. And Barack Obama was a younger baby boomer, but even the early half of the baby boom, it's really more the early half of the baby boom generation that's been so enormously influential. And again, in a lot of ways, the younger generations did not get those opportunities. And even today, I had an interesting conversation with a guy who runs one of the largest churches in the United States. He's a millennial, and he gets these texts from older boomer people, almost kind of like, "Hey, young whippersnapper, you better be careful," kind of texts. And he's like, these were the people who, when they were young, refused to wear suits. When the older generation said you have to wear a suit to preach, they said, "Nah, we're not going to do that." They did what they wanted. They rebelled against previous generations, but they expect subsequent generations to kind of get in line a little bit. And I think, for me, when I look at this guy like Redeemed Zoomer and his quest to retake mainline denominations, I think that seems pretty unlikely, to be quiet. I'm looking at myself like that doesn't seem like it. But you know what I don't want to do? I don't want to force Gen Z into my box. And I think we really have to separate teaching people to obey the commandments of Christ and forcing younger generations into our paradigms. And I think the reality is, if the church is going to thrive in America, the paradigms of how church is done they're going to have to change a lot. And baby boomer people like Bill Hybels and Rick Warren, they changed the paradigms. That's one of the ways that they built large, successful churches that reached many, many people of particular generations. We need to give younger people the same opportunity that the boomers were given to get on stage and see what they can do, and without being, second guessed all the time, and without being on a leash all the time. And I think, I think the best of Gen Z might be the best we've ever had in America. And I think we need to empower younger generations and not just assume that, like, wow, I'm going to be able to sit here. When I do this analysis, look at my analysis. A lot of people think people like it. I mean, this three worlds analysis is basically, it was called, I think Christianity Today called it the dominant paradigm of how American evangelicals understand this cultural moment. But the idea that I should feel that I know so much better than everybody else, that I'm going to design what everybody else needs to be doing and try to force, these younger millennials and Gen Z people to do what I'm telling them to. I want to give them like my best thinking, but I also want to support them. I want to see them go. I want to create the space in which they can adapt to the changing times. And I think we have been for too long continuing to be locked into a paradigm that was shaped for the cultural moment that is no longer with us. And so we're going to have to change the paradigm, and that's going to be very uncomfortable to baby boomers and Generation X people like us, because we're so dialed in on our experiences. But we have to be willing, I think, to let go a little bit. That would be my feedback.
Man, I love it. Well, that feeds right into the whole heart of what we do at Summit Ministries in equipping and supporting the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. And I had significant conversations last week with two of my former students from a Summit Ministries program, one who's 19, one who's 21, both of whom I think should be platformed. I think they need to be up there right now, not because they're going to say everything perfectly, but they've been well-formed, they're discerning, and they learn. They are curious people who learn and grow. And I'm ready. Okay.
Great.
Man, there's so many more things I would love to talk about here, but I think you've really helped kind of give me a sense that there is hope in this generation. I need to be thinking through more, what is the psychology of Gen Z who've never sensed a sense of loss of a Christian world because they never knew that world. I don't have a single student or summer staffer, even they're up into their mid-20s, who was even alive when 9/11 took place, for example.
This is when I was talking with the guy who was an executive at a Christian nonprofit, and he said, when James Dobson died, his younger staff, his Gen Z staff, were very confused at all the articles because they'd never heard of him. They'd never heard of him. And it's like I was, got a message from a Gen Z pastor. He's like, yeah, Tim Keller is like a name in a textbook in my seminary. He's not a guy that, I was being shaped by because he retired like long before I got on the scene. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there is this sense in which you think, these big boomer figures, and you go to a Gen Z person, they're like, what? They don't even know who they are. They don't know who they are. Even. The other thing, here's the example, and I don't know how much time we got. We might be running to the end here, but I got to give you one example of the psychological difference that I think people might relate to. Starting in the 1960s, America's cities went into decline, and they really hit bottom in the 1970s. And in the 80s, there was a little bit of a turnaround, kind of some of the things we know were there. And then it was really in the 90s, in the post-Giuliani era, where things started to get better, and then 2000s exploded. And so baby boomers basically lived through the era of the decline of the city. And, when Youngtown Sheet and Tube or something closed on Black Monday and 5,000 people lost their job. The plants are closing. The department store where your mom took you to for tea with white gloves is closed. The old neighborhood you grew up in fell into ruin. It's decline, 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 decline. And so, and of course, guys like me, think about Bruce Springsteen's song, My Hometown, if you remember that song. It's a song about deindustrialization, and it's this boomer guy taking his kid around town and all this stuff, and his lap, showing him the town. Of course, Gen X, we were raised on that. Cities were declining in our childhood. But really, it was with the millennials. And I moved to the city in 92, so it's like, I'm not saying no boomers or Gen X people participated in the urban renaissance, but like it was really millennials who came of age when cities were already starting to revive and cities were getting cool again, and maybe they grew up watching Seinfeld or Friends or something like that. And they had a different idea of the city. It wasn't Taxi Driver anymore. It wasn't Escape from New York. They're looking around their hometown, which may be a deindustrial Midwest city, and they're like, wait a minute, there's a new coffee shop there. Wait a minute, there's a new condo building going in there. They're seeing things get better. So millennials had a completely different psychology and relationship to the city because they came of age when it was on the way up, not on the way down. And so in essence, I'm not saying Gen Z is kind of at necessarily the bottom. We could go down a lot more. But there is something to be said about the difference in psychology from riding the escalator down and riding it up kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Aaron, you've given us a whole lot to think about with all of this. I'm really amazed. I took a bunch of notes as we were going through just on my paper here of things I want to be looking up as we go forward. But I thank you for helping take the time to bring an understanding of where we are in this cultural moment, where the challenges are, and where the hope is. I know the people who are watching and listening to this show are in the exact position of having to help discern how to bring up a rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Renn, for coming on the show. We had to dig into some really tough stuff, but I want you to know you can follow Aaron's work by just going to Aaron, Aaron, Aaron Renn, RENN, AaronRenn.com to find more of his resources. And this podcast is brought to you by Summit Ministries. We're helping this next generation and those who guide them know God's truth and live it out. So for resources to inspire the young people in your life, just go to summit.org. We'll help you there. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.